Hello lovelies. Today we're taking a look at the Electric State from Free League, based again on the artwork of Simon Stålenhag. I think I've pronounced that right. So this is the third book in their series of Stålenhag booklets. Tales from the Loop, Things from the Flood, those were the previous ones. So it's the third in the series, but it's not extending the narrative of those other two books, though it shares obviously quite a lot of DNA with those other books. Rather, this is its whole own thing. There is another Stålenhag art book called The Labyrinth. Are we going to see that become an RPG as well? Seems fairly likely, given Free League handled the Kickstarter for the art book, but while I still appreciate Stålenhag's art, I'm starting to feel a bit like these games are a bit one note, unfortunately. So, like the other Stålenhag works, the Electric State is set in an alternative past, the 1990s again for this one, same as Things from the Flood. You could probably cross-use some material from one to the others. Nostalgia for the 1990s always hits me a bit weird, because you know, those were my formative sort of teenage young adult years when I was on the scene, but I don't associate a particular vibe with the 90s. 80s, yes. 70s, yes. 60s, yes. 50s, yes. Even 40s, even 30s. I can pick up on a vibe to do with those time periods, those decades, you know, visual, music, all the rest of it. But the 1990s hits me weird because I was thoroughly embedded in the sort of goth industrial subculture rather than the surface culture, and so I don't have the same cultural touchstones that a lot of other people have. I don't have like visual tags that I necessarily associate with the 90s, so if there are any extra visuals on this video today, I'm going by what other people say are 90s and what my video software says is 90s. I also think the 1990s was when we had really the beginning of the end of identifiable eras in youth subculture and so on. The rise of the internet kind of shattered it, so you couldn't look at society around you in the way you could in the 1950s and say, oh right, greasers, rock and roll music, pompadour hairdos, chromed cars with fins. You know, starting in the 90s, you couldn't really do that anymore. Maybe the last really identifiable youth movement was emo, perhaps. And ever since, it feels like there isn't really anything distinct. There aren't distinct musical or artistic fashion eras in the same way. And I think the 90s were the beginning of the end of that. It's the last one where you can kind of pick up on slight little hints of it, but for me, I wasn't part of that. So 90s nostalgia doesn't really get to me in the way that the 70s or 80s nostalgia does, because the 90s were weird. I'm sure I've waffled about that before, but you've got to fill video time somehow. This one is set by default in the nation of Pacifica, which is mostly California as was. The end papers are maps, and you get this nice fold out map as well of the whole place. But as I say, it's an alternate history, and there are two major points of divergence. The technological divergence and the political divergence. Politically, in this timeline, there was a second civil war in the USA, which is kind of topical at the moment, I suppose. And that will have had big consequences for the rest of the world, but we don't really get to see anything about the rest of the world outside of a little bit about Canada and a little bit about Mexico. This civil war rose out of a much worse Vietnam War that the US still lost despite the technological changes, but which was far more vicious and destructive. Add into that the oil crisis and the general economic downturn of the 1970s, the pardoning of Nixon, which led to an assassination attempt on President Ford's life. I think. The passage about that isn't particularly well written, and Americans have this propensity for calling ex-presidents president still, which makes it confusing whether it was an attempt on Nixon's life, understandable, or an attempt on Ford's life, slightly less understandable. But I think from the context they're talking about an assassination attempt on Ford. Anyone who's more au fait with the background presented in the art book may have a better idea than I do. I'm not sure, but I think that's the way it was. Anyway, that assassination attempt led to mass protests rather than the shrug we've had recently, a great deal of political division, again much like we see today, and eventually the massacre of protesters in Franklin Square in Washington DC, not far from the White House, by the military who had been called out to defend the White House. That then plunged America into a civil war in 1975. The year of my birth is the year of death of America in this setting, which, I don't know, it tickles me. That led to a cyberpunk-style breakup of the United States, with California and Texas seceding first, and others following suit, and new nations appearing and disappearing in that tumult. In the aftermath of that civil war, as things calmed down again, war veterans and other skilled, independent-minded folk took to the backwoods, made their own off-grid communities. America balkanized. The cities started to try and patch things together a little bit with varying levels of success. And the smaller post-Civil War countries were left more vulnerable, particularly to corporate takeover throughout the 1980s. And no corporation was bigger or more powerful than Centra or Centre, who are the creators and purveyors of what is called neuronic systems and drones which became the kind of de facto weapon of war from the 1960s in this setting. So that's the major technological divide. In this setting we have neuronics, which is similar to neural networks but far more powerful, similar to the way I think it's called balance technology exists in Tales from the Loop and so on. So in this we have neuronics, which is a powerful form of virtual reality and computing that gave us all the things which were originally promised by virtual reality and the internet, but in this case it actually kind of followed through, though as it turns out at a cost. It can be hard to convey to people today, given the nature of the internet today, quite how idealistic and transformative the internet and the idea of virtual reality seemed to be in the 1990s. I mean, today VR has certain uses here and there. People can have systems in their home if they want them, but it's not a general must-have technology for everybody. And the technology is a lot better than it was in the 1990s. I remember visiting the Trocadero in London, mostly to play on the Battletech pods that they had there, which was a crude form of VR, I suppose, but they also had big bulky VR headset games of like a duel, where you both step into this pod and run around this virtual landscape of basic shapes, shooting at each other. I remember that. I think there was also a fantasy game in similar pods in the same sort of period, but it never really lived up to its potential. It was always a bit disappointing. Things are a lot better now, but the technology still hasn't lifted off in the same way that, 3D television comes along every now and again, or 3D cinema comes along every now and again. I think VR is one of those technologies. It's a solution in search of a problem. Anyway, in this world, all of that followed through. The neuronics allowed for a degree of man-machine interface and a way of manipulating data and so on from within a virtual reality. It made all that possible and was first created in the 1960s by DARPA or its equivalent. So that kind of echoes the development of the internet in the real world, initially used for the military and as a tool. And in this world, it allowed drone pilots to control very, very powerful weapons of war from a distance safely. So it kind of dehumanized warfare and allowed people to operate without losing so many casualties because they were using these drones. And drones aren't just what we think of as drones, little flying things or predator drones or whatever. These included robotic systems, which I guess are more properly called Waldos, and also robots more generally could be given these neuronic networks and so on. So a lot of the war, the Civil War, was fought using drones as well. And now neuronics, like the internet in the real world today, is now everywhere. But since the last major update to the software for the neuronic helmets that you use to plug in, people have become blissful, addicted, unable or unwilling to leave this blissful, heavenly virtual plane for the real world, which has become increasingly shit, and thus starving and dying of thirst while still hooked up to their machines. Which, even if you don't get addicted yet, those machines are necessary for doing just about anything technological in the world. So you're going to find yourself weighing up whether it's worth risking putting your head in one of these helmets to do something or not. Yeah, the allegories in this game are a bit heavy-handed. The subtext is more like the text in Yellow Submarine, big stone things looming over the landscape. So couple all this with renegade machines, weirdly mutated machines, alien, possibly AI intelligences seeming to evolve out of the digital soup of the neuronic network, weird scrap-built things that are combinations of flesh and metal stalking the landscape, and you have all of that Stålenhag trademark nostalgia and weirdness coming through. The book gives us a historical rundown, timeline, and overview of the main sort of players and changes and differences in the timeline. A slightly more in-depth guide to the area of Pacifica. Some information on other nations around the former US, or in the case of Nevada, a radioactive and bombed out hellhole that used to be a state and is now called the Black Welt Exclusion Zone. But yeah, it's a bit weird that there's no information about the rest of the world, considering the creators of the game are from Northern Europe. You would think they might pay a little bit more attention to Europe, but then that may be a commentary on US isolationism and self-obsession, possibly. But it would have been nice for us guys in the rest of the world to know what's happened to us. They may have underestimated that appeal a little bit. Where Tales from the Loop and Things from the Flood are static, community-based, community-oriented games where your characters are often rooted in family because they're children or teenagers. Excuse me. This is a road trip game, somewhat reminiscent in some ways of the game Pacific Drive, which I streamed a little bit of on the Grimstreams channel and liked very much. Or a similar game kind of inspired by both that I have half completed, along with like a dozen other half completed projects. So it is different in that it is a journey game without those strong character links necessarily. So your character is called a traveller. They're made up of an archetype, a handful of stats: strength, agility, wits, empathy, a talent or two, health points, the usual sort of thing. Fairly loose, fairly simple. It does use the Year Zero engine, So all my usual criticisms to that apply here. Attributes generally run from 2 to 6, and that's how many dice that you roll. A talent might give you access to special capabilities or exceptions to the rules, or +2 dice for certain actions. And that's pretty much it. So characters feel a bit undefined and weak, even for a Year Zero game. Because even with an applicable talent and the highest possible stat, you're going to be rolling at best 8d6, and you need 6s for successes. So on a base average difficulty sort of event roll you might have to do, where you're not taking any penalties and you're not getting any bonuses, that's only about a 75% success rate. Now the Games Master can dole out modifiers to these rolls, which adds or removes dice, but it's diminishing returns as you add dice, and it's not until you're rolling 14 dice that your odds of success on a standard task come to a virtual certainty with a probability of 99% or so. Can you get to that? Can you get to 14 dice? Maybe. The highest possible stat is 6 dice. Maybe get +2 for an easy task, making 8d6. +2 more because you happen to have an applicable talent would take us to 10d6. Maximum gear bonus seems to be +3d6, so that would take us to 13. And then maybe with a couple of people helping you, if they can, you can get a few more dice to get you over the line. But I think we can all agree that this is going to be a vanishingly rare set of circumstances. Now, it does say rolls are supposed to be reserved for dramatic and tense situations, but when you're judging the difficulty of doing things, you need something to calibrate it against for difficulty. And seemingly all Year Zero games are terrible for this. Now you could house rule. There are variations on Year Zero where you can roll larger dice, or there are other mechanics. You could extend the range of success, stuff like that. But rules as written, it has the usual problems that most Year Zero games tend to have. Now you can push your dice, which is their common mechanic across Year Zero games. So you take the dice that failed and you roll them again and try and get more 6s. But pushing also carries risk with it. In this game, pushing and failing, rolling 1s, drops your hope score, which is an abstraction of how confident and willing your character is to go on with their mission, with their trip. Or 1s can also degrade your gear if you push yourself using your gear dice, which are separate bonuses. So the probabilities almost demand that you push every roll, but to do so rapidly degrades your character. So it's all my usual complaints about the Year Zero engine. At the center of this version of the game are the hope stat and tension and bliss. So tension is a measure of intra-party conflict between different characters, and it gives you bonus dice if you're in a state of tension with another character in the group. This seems like a weird thing to bother incorporating because most of that sort of thing is going to come out in roleplay, and I think it's going to be virtually pointless, as intra-party conflict tends to prevent progress on the mission at hand and that sense of accomplishment and overcoming that people are generally looking for in games. I think even devoted drama kid role players will tend to avoid that kind of intra-party conflict, because in just about every game that we play, that's a bad thing. Now, you could take that tension system and apply it instead to enemies, roadblocks, situations that your characters find themselves in, escalating the tension to provide bonuses but also increasing the danger, and that would offset some of the probability problems with the success rates. But that's just not the game as it's written, which is what you have to review. Bliss is something you accumulate through exposure to the neuronic networks. That's that threat of getting so sucked into the virtual world that you never want to leave, and you'll allow your body to waste away and die while you're plugged into the network. If you run out of hope, you suffer a mental breakdown and someone will have to buck you up about your ideas. Too much tension, you might come to blows with other characters. Too much bliss, you disappear into virtual reality. You do have a health rating. A health rating of 5 is pretty good. That measures how much physical punishment you can take. And for reference, a magnum does a base of 3 damage, and attacks do +1 damage for every extra 6 you roll on your attack dice, and armor reduces damage. So it's all very simple, probably not as deadly as it should be given the relative unlikeliness of rolling, even a single 6, let alone 2 or 3 or 4. And you're only instantly killed if you take double your normal health maximum of damage in one roll. Otherwise you are down and you have to make death saves essentially on 4d6 and accumulate enough successes to stabilize. And that's about it, really. That's an overview of the world and an overview of the system and its slight differences and quirks. We do get a whole bunch of tables and ideas and reasons for travelling, types of roadblock along the way, some inspiration, some random charts. There's also a fairly usable single-player system for self-running the game using cards. I always feel like these random tables in these books, particularly ones for solo play, should be much, much bigger, because the same things tend to come out quite a lot. So the bigger the tables are, the more options there are, the better, so you can avoid that repetition and maybe have more combinations and things that might surprise you. But they're not too bad here. They're largely limited by the fact they've decided to just stick with the D6. So the biggest tables you're going to find in here are D66s, where you take 1 D6 as the 10s effectively and 1 D6 as the units, which is only 36 different combinations. So yeah, I just don't think it's quite enough. You get good enough for 1, maybe 2 games, but then I think the repetitious nature is going to start popping up and making things feel old. Now a talented GM can work around that, but again you've got to judge the book as it is, as it exists. We do get more detail and subsystems about neuronics, and I think this game may well suffer from the netrunner problem, where someone goes delving into the neuronic network, risking bliss and so on, while everyone else sits around twiddling their thumbs. Again, skilled GMs can address this, but it is always a problem when someone has their own specific subsystem that they're particularly good at, and it's a way of overcoming a problem, and they're the only ones that can do it. So, or the only ones that it makes sense to do it. We do also get details on some of the drones, robots, some generic threats like law enforcement, and so on, but honestly, not enough. We do get some pre-gens, some NPCs, a sample road trip, but to my mind, and you know how I feel about adventures, especially in core books, this space would have been better used with tables and ideas for creating more threats, for statting up more drones and robots and weird devices and mutations and AIs and whatever else. I think we would have been far better off using the space that they've devoted to that, to the adventure, for doing that. And some more generic threats and wildlife and things would have been nice to have in here as well. It does have the usual kind of genuflections that we come to expect from all games, safety tools and all the rest of it. It's not very 90s. To my mind, the 90s was a high point in social progress, because we just didn't give a fuck, and that is the best way to be, I think. I feel like we have backslid on rights and respecting the individual since the 1990s, and the idea of safety tools during the equivalent of the Iron Age in comics, I guess, for RPGs, you know, when Vampire and so on was at its peak, the idea of safety tools would have made most of us laugh and snort our Mad Dog 2020 out of our nostrils. So it's kind of sad, but to me, the way I'm looking at it now, I think I said so in a recent review, is that these genuflections is the same as when games during the Satanic Panic and just after always felt like they had to have their excuses. You know, that they had to get ahead of that and say, you know, this game isn't real, don't mistake it for reality, these spells don't work, demons aren't real. This is just that for this weird secular religion that has taken hold. So same thing, same shit, different decade. There's a few typos, probably a result of translation issues, I would think. There's some slightly distorted text. Stålenhag's work itself is, as ever, impeccable, but there is a somewhat jarring disjunct between, let's find an example, one of Stålenhag's pieces and the other spot illustrations. You know, one is photorealistic, ethereal, all of that kind of cool stuff. The other, while competent and fine and great in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with the art, it's just it really jars with the Stålenhag work. So while his work's impeccable, there is this jarring disjunct between his art and the other art in the book, which is fine, but it does mean that the style really doesn't flow between the two, and so you lose that sense of realism, or dreamlike realism, or remembered realism that Stålenhag's work has, and that the book otherwise evokes, and then stuff like that just throws you out of it. It probably would have been too expensive to get Stålenhag to do work specifically for the book, but there are plenty of other artists, concept artists and so on out there, who could have done something at least similar in a way, and that would have been better, I think. So yeah, some typos, some slightly distorted text. They made a choice on some of these pages not to extend a full bleed, and you can see the fake tape. Well, I don't know if you can make it out on this video, but there's this fake tape pinning the pictures to the page. But I also found these white gaps where a full bleed would have made more sense to be a little bit ugly. And it looks like a mistake or a printer issue when it's not. It's actually a conscious choice, but they're right near the edge, right? So this would make more sense if it was full bleed to the edge of the book. Instead, they've moved it in, but they've only moved it in enough where it looks like a mistake. So you'd have to move it in another, I don't know, quarter inch, maybe, for it to look like it was actually pinned into the book. And if you were aiming for a sort of scrapbook look, then you shouldn't spread it across 2 pages, because that's not how scrapbooking works usually. So yeah, some inconsistency in the presentation, I felt. The layout's fine, readable, it's practical, so that's fine. So overall, for style, I give it a 4 out of 5, but really only because of Stålenhag's art, which is the major selling point. I mean, you could buy this or the art book, and with this you get a game and stuff as well, so there's some added value there. But without Stålenhag's art, I would drop it 1, maybe even 2 points in terms of presentation. Substance-wise, it feels lacking. Some of that is due to the difference between this and the other works, because I think a road trip game has a much broader scope, which means you can't have the same level of detail as you would get in Loop or Flood, but they even skimp on the information that you could have had on threats and roadblocks drones, cults, law enforcement. I mean, they mention these things, but they're all very basically covered when they could have been more expansively covered. Especially the weird things that might be out there, the different kinds of drones and robots and so on, aren't really covered with any kind of real depth, you know? Juxtapose that with my antipathy towards wasting main book pages on starter adventures, and the substance level becomes severely lacking. You know, where's the esoteric drone generator? I'd rather have that than a sample adventure that we play at most once. So that kind of necessarily drops the substance to a 3. You know, you have what you need, but you don't have any more. So that's a 7 out of 10, 3.5 out of 5. I mean, that's not bad, it's above average. It's worth it as an art book with added value, but compared to the other works in the series, it's a bit disappointingly paint by numbers by the Free League folks, and just not up to the standard, or perhaps just retreading a well-worn path at this point. So I hope if there is a labyrinth-based game that they innovate and do something different. Zang.
A problem for every games master has always been coming up with adventure ideas. For years now, Postmortem Studios has been helping out with the 100 Adventure Seeds line. These provide adventure ideas for all genres, and you can get them at RPG Now or lulu.com.